A new analysis from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis says that oil and gas companies across Western Canada are unable to meet their share of the total $72 billion, that's billion with a B, in future decommissioning obligations, even if oil prices stay above $85 a barrel. I'm going to talk to Omar Mawji, energy data analyst for the Institute. So welcome to the interview, Omar.
It's great to be here, Markham.
Now, there's been a lot of discussion for the last, for years about environmental liabilities associated with orphan wells, inactive wells in Western Canada. This is not a big surprise, and yet it's still, I think the big surprise here is that even if oil prices are high, that these environmental liabilities are going to fall to somebody else to pay other than the oil companies.
Yeah, and I think it's always been an issue, like regardless of the oil price environment. It's just that now it's a near-term issue. So we have policies in Canada that obviously revolve around decarbonization, reaching net zero, and that's made decommissioning liabilities more of an imminent problem than it was, looking back in 2018 and 2014.
Okay, so a lot of the companies for whom this is a big problem tend to be small to medium sized, as opposed to the bigger ones. But why would this become a bank problem?
So the reason why it becomes a bank problem is because the bank is basically the lender of last resort. It's the last financier to these smaller oil and gas companies. And you can see if you look at the capital stack of a lot of these companies, the credit facility is the main asset that they use in good times and then also in bad times. So these credit facilities will stay with these companies up until basically they're producing their last barrel. And those are the, I guess that credit facility is going to be the one that's most impacted by their inability to pay decommissioning liabilities.
Now, I've been told by people who've worked in the banking in Western Canada on the oil and gas side that banks are terrified of more failures, oil and gas company failures, because the only assets they have are the wells and the pipelines and so on, that are the very things that constitute the environmental liabilities. And the banks don't want to get stuck with them because then they have to pay for the cleanup. How much of that is a factor?
So I think, the banks don't want to take control of the asset just generally because it's, that's not the bank's business. And so that's part of the reason why they don't want to take control of an asset like that in the event of insolvency. But I think, yeah, you're right, especially in with reference to the recent Redwater ruling case by the Supreme Court of Canada, it's become an even bigger issue because the banks are no longer first in line. Basically, the Alberta Energy Regulator will be first in line. They'll get whatever proceeds from assets first, then the banks will get the rest. And that's not a situation they've been comfortable with. And it's not a situation they expected, basically, up until less than 3 years ago.
Now, your study says that 5 out of the 10 companies that could be on the hook for $3.5 billion indicate that decommissioning liabilities will increase by more than 30% from current financial reporting over the next decade, even in a high price environment. What do you mean by that?
So we basically, we look out, the analysis we've done is we've looked at these companies. We've basically projected out their production from their proved reserves, which is their lowest risk form of reserves, as well as their some of their probable reserves. And then we've included their decline rate. So over time, over the next 20 years, as they produce these resources, inevitably the production will decline and their ability to create free cash flow will decline. And while that's happening, they will still have to drill more wells, which means they'll have to incur further future decommissioning liabilities. And so all of that adds up to, at the end of 20 years, most of these companies having larger decommissioning liabilities in 20 years than they do currently on their balance sheet. And so that's basically the
right. So your study says that it's not clear that if companies are adequately reporting their asset retirement obligations to the Alberta Energy Regulator, that if the companies aren't being square with the regulator, or the regulators, being lax and not letting, or not insisting that they report, That's got to be that banks should be worried. And I guess at the end of the day, the taxpayer should be worried.
Yeah, and I think it also has to do with the resources. Like there's not enough capacity really to look at all these liabilities in depth. And so they really rely on previous reporting or there are wells out there that claim to have 200,000 in costs. When you actually go to the site, you see that there's road work that needs to be done to get access to the well, as well as abandoned and reclamation costs. So that adds up to, it could be in the scope of 700,000, maybe 800,000. So it's significantly more than reported, and that takes resources that the Alberta Energy Regulator doesn't have, nor do a lot of these companies making big acquisitions of a ton of wells.
So I think, well, let me put it this way. I've interviewed consulting firm Wood Mackenzie, which has said that basically they expect to see high oil prices through the 2020s. And then after 2030, we basically hit peak oil somewhere around 2030-ish. Then demand declines and the party's over. So this is oil's last big boom. And if these kind of issues don't get resolved now, while the companies are still making fairly good free cash flow, then they never get resolved unless the taxpayer has to step in and pay for all of it. Is that a fair scenario?
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're warning. We're saying, look, if in this current environment where oil prices are $100 and they also can help.
Omar, I'm going to have to interrupt you. You froze up there for most of your answer.
Oh,
sorry about that. Can you take that from the top?
Yeah. So basically what this is saying is, the creditors will be the first to be impacted by this. So if companies aren't willing to pay down decommissioning liabilities in a $100 oil environment, then they won't be willing to do that in an $80 oil environment, and the creditors will be the first ones that lose out. They will face write-downs, and so this is basically a warning to creditors, saying that if you want to take these decommissioning liabilities seriously and you believe they're an imminent threat to your credit facility, then you need to put in place covenants. You need to restrict the amount of capital that you provide these smaller companies in order to protect yourself. And also that, by keeping these companies in check through covenants, they also benefit the taxpayer, who may not have to, abandon as many high-risk wells as they would if there weren't any checks and balances in place.
So how many of these companies have gotten they're in a situation where, the old saying, if I owe $1,000 to the bank, I have a problem. If I owe $1 million to the bank's got a problem. And so how many, these companies are now so far into their credit facilities and in such bad shape that the chances of them, righting the ship is pretty slim, and the bank's basically just keeping them afloat because they don't want to have to assume their environmental liabilities. Is that I had an ex-banker tell me that's a common situation. What's your take on it?
So that was a common situation when oil prices were low. It's not so much right now. Right now, everyone's kind of blanketed by the high oil prices, the high free cash flow that they're generating. So it's not so much a worry right now. But when you look at the futures curve, you see oil prices at $70 into 2025, 2026. So we're not too far off from potentially seeing oil prices fall back down once that geopolitical risk calms down and supply issues come down as well. So then that becomes an issue. Then that becomes a real risk for the banks.
My takeaway from this conversation, Omar, is that again, here we are facing, if not an imminent crisis, a crisis in the near term or near to medium term. And if action isn't taken, then there are going to be dire consequences. Somebody is going to be left holding the bag, and the only question is who.
Yeah, exactly. And it's easy, the issue obviously will fall on, just because of uh the ranking of debt, it will fall on the creditors first, so the creditors will lose out first. But in the meantime, it's important to mention that a lot of the decommissioning work is actually being funded right now by the taxpayer. So when we looked at the three companies mentioned in the report, Obsidian Energy, Cardinal Energy, and Surge, 50% of their decommissioning costs are actually taxpayer funded. So they're not doing all the work. And so, if that were to be reduced, if the taxpayer no longer provided them capital, if the orphan well program was not provided loans to decommission or to abandon and reclaim wells, then there is a case that the risk becomes even higher, and that the taxpayer at the end of the day will have to fund the whole thing. So,
well, this is there have been many warning that this day was coming, and now it appears that it's just that much closer. Omar, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
yeah, you're welcome. It's great to speak with you.